Okay, hello. Welcome back to our lunch study break. It is Wednesday, October 13th, 2021. We are in a new year and we're continuing our gathering here. So first of all, I hope everyone is doing well and feeling okay and had a meaningful high holiday experience. I'm excited for today's class. I mentioned to you before the new year that I was excited to take this opportunity to begin to share with you some Martin Buber, specifically I and Thou. We had this, maybe it was during Hanukkah or Purim, we had this game show online, Cahoots, and we were asking questions to say, what was Rabbi Russell's bat mitzvah theme? And then who's Rabbi Ain's favorite thinker? And I was like, one of the questions was, who's Rabbi Ain's favorite thinker? And the question came up, and I was like, I'm not sure. And the answer turned out to be Martin Buber. And I said, you know what, that's right. That's correct. So what I want to share with you is I became exposed to Martin Buber during my junior year abroad at Hebrew University, living in Jerusalem. I had studied analytical philosophy, was my major at Brandeis University. I studied moral relativity for the most part, and really analytical philosophy as it was taught. And I grew, I guess, as I turned 20 into my early 20s, grew increasingly disillusioned with moral relativism. And when I was studying at Hebrew University, I took a philosophy class that discussed the relationship between two great German Jewish thinkers that lived 100 years ago, Franz Rosenzweig and Martin Buber. And by learning more about their relationship, the humanity of the relationship between the two of them, and ultimately by learning more about the philosophy, the existentialist religious philosophy that they really spearheaded, changed my perspective on life and got me to find a way in through philosophy and through meaning into what I thought was missing in the analytical, moral, relativistic world in which I had been educated. Okay, so now let me talk for a little bit. I want to give you this background of how this classic book, this book here, this is one of the great 20th century Jewish classics, I and Thou. I want to give, before I get into it, I want to give a lot of background about it. How did it come to be? Where did it come out of? Because it is a hard book to apprehend and understand on its face. So first, let me tell you a little bit about who Martin Buber was. All right, so there he is. There's Martin Buber here. That is him. I'm guessing this is towards the end of his life when he was living in Israel. All right, there he is. All right, now let me share with you a little bit about who he was. So this comes from the Stanford University Encyclopedia of Philosophy. He was born in 1878. Prolific author and scholar, literary translator, and political activist whose writings, mostly in German and Hebrew, range from Jewish mysticism to social philosophy, biblical studies, religious phenomenology, so on and so forth. Most famous is this book, the short but powerful book, I and Thou, 1923, where our relations to others is considered as twofold. Okay, we're going to get into that. Don't worry about the philosophy of it just yet. It's interesting to note he was a rich kid. Came from a very affluent family, and part of the affluence is why he was able to escape and move to Israel. I just always thought that was it provided him with the financial security until German occupation of Poland, when their estate was expropriated. He was homeschooled and pampered and was a bookish aesthete with very few friends. Something interesting about him as a personality that I have always found compelling. And then what I want to do is share with you, there's a new wonderful biography out of Buber, which is here somewhere here it is, by Paul Mendes Flower, who is pretty, let me share it. So here it is. This is Martin Buber. Just came out this year, A Life of Faith and Dissent. So let me just share with you a little bit from that book, in which he talks about his relationship with Franz Rosenzweig. So who was Franz Rosenzweig? Well, Franz Rosenzweig here, 1886 to 1929, one of the most original Jewish thinkers of the modern period, a historian of philosophy, brief but noteworthy role in a neo-Hegelian revival, who ultimately left that field and rededicated himself to Jewish learning and Jewish thinking. Jeff.
So his parents were part of that bourgeois culture, Viennese culture of the late 19th, early 20th century, that were patrons of the arts, and the Schoenbergs, the Bloch-Bauers, Adela Bloch-Bauer, the Woman in Gold. So I had no idea. I thought he was German.
So he was able to live a rather privileged lifestyle, which explains why he was able to, study and do a lot of the work that he was able to do. And so take a look here from this biography. We have this beautiful relationship that flowers between Rosenzweig and Buber. It says only 2 months have passed since they first got to know each other, and they exchanged a few letters, but they knew right away that they had a special relationship. Already in the second half hour of their visit, his interaction with Rosenzweig had taken on a nigh messianic quality of mutual trust. They just had this special, beautiful relationship with him. And Rosenzweig, who was really the academic, with Buber, sort of, as you mentioned, Jeff, this rich Viennese, seems to have gladly taken on the task of drawing Buber out of his inner isolation. And he was determined to get him to speak properly and be an effective teacher. This is so interesting, I think, especially for those of you who've been coming to my classes for the past year, check this next part out. And I think this really highlights what I try to do in my work. So he says, when he visited Happenheim, Buber had parenthetically mentioned his desire to read Hasidic texts with a few people. So Rosenzweig suggested that he do so with him there with his wife. Okay, so then Buber disappeared among his bookshelves, returned with 2 or 3 texts, and we started reading. He proved to be a rather clumsy teacher. At the Lehrhaus, the Lehrhaus was the Frankfurt Lehrhaus, was the ultimate adult Jewish education center in Frankfurt and around the world, sort of the model. The Lehrhaus Judaica is named after the Frankfurt Lehrhaus, which was started by Rosenzweig, and where Buber taught. And at the Lehrhaus, under Rosenzweig's tutelage, Buber would slowly hone his pedagogical skills. His initial steps as a teacher were faltering and uncertain, particularly in leading seminars. So Ernest Simon, one of his closest associates, wrote him a scathing critique in the manner in which he taught. So I want to share this with you. In a long, detailed letter to Buber, Simon candidly expressed the deeply depressing impact the seminar had upon him and everything that troubled me about you as the leader of the seminar. He faulted Buber for thoughtlessly inviting the participants to speak their minds so as to allow for mutual advising and helping. The result was a partly hysterical, somewhat shameless barrage of questions that appalled not only Simon, but many others. From the expression on your face, rarely a flicker of irony, mostly a kindly smile, it was apparent that you did not feel the full force of what was going on there. Simon attributed Buber's inability to conduct an orderly and constructive seminar to his failure to take into account his audience. You thought you were standing naked before God when you were only standing before Fraulein H, a terrible sight. Everyone who loves you had to cry inwardly, and you were not even aware of it. In essence, Simon concluded Buber's pedagogical failure was due to his pietistic idealism. So Buber was taken aback by this critique. So what does he do? He turns to his amazing professor friend, Franz Rosenzweig, who's this great former Hegelian professor of renown. And he shares with him that Buber turned to Rosenzweig and reported that Simon was upset by what he regarded as the samelish quotations of the last lesson, and my convenience there too. Rosenzweig was interested in improving Buber's teaching, but he reassured Buber that he was on the right track. So this is from Rosenzweig's letter. Simon first showed me his letter. Of course, Rosenzweig writes, he is right. As right as someone who does not believe in the transformation of merchants into worshipers through the minyan, the transformation of sensation seekers into people in genuine need, though not demonstrable. Nevertheless, one must believe in the possibility, and Ernest Simon will also believe in it one day, once he gets the hangover from his dreamy faith in the power of form to save a person. Then he too will remember the healing power of freedom, which is wont to regard merely as a poisonous flower, which it surely is also. So in contrast to Simon's more conventional conception of the role of the teacher, Rosenzweig wanted a less structured dialogical mode of teaching, which he encouraged Buber to develop. And I think that's important. One is because when I first got to this shul, after I led one of these sessions or one of my Torah sessions, someone came after me and said, Rabbi, you let people talk much too much. I just want to hear what you think. I just want to hear what and I said, no, that's not the pedagogy I'm going for. I was going for a dialogical, emergent type of thinking in getting to know each other and talking about who we are and being personal and being subjective. It's not about what the rabbi thinks or dispensing wisdom on high, but it is through the process of getting to know each other and in dialogue that the presence of God becomes apparent. Right? That sort of is the foundation for thinking about I and thou. And as Buber and Rosenzweig developed this, now unfortunately, Rosenzweig composed this letter in 1923, but by that time he had already lost his ability because he was suffering from ALS. At that time, he could still dictate letters and essays, but by the spring of 23, he was unable to speak at all. Ultimately, by means of a specially constructed typewriter, he somehow maintained his correspondences, even as his disease progressed. And although the medical prognosis was that he had only 1 year to live, he endured for 6 more years through his friendship. And let me share with you a picture of Rosenzweig. See that? Can you guys make that one out there? There he is. 6 years he lived. And in that time he corresponded and he translated the Bible and other works with Buber. In fact, Rosenzweig offered critical comments on the printer's proof of I and thou, and he was gratefully thankful for his commentary. So they shared the conviction. This is why this is important, and I think why it sticks out in the 20th century and why it's such a memorable work, because they shared this conviction that since the Enlightenment, the life of religious faith had been lamentably constricted, confined to one of the disparate competing spheres of activity and value that characterized modern society. It's consigned to the domain of individual choice. Mendes Flower writes that religious faith had become a subjective option. Max Weber famously noted that one had an ear for religion or did not. But at the very outset of his lectures, Buber roundly rejected Weber's view. Religious faith, he argued, is not a gift among other gifts that one has or doesn't have. One is not religious in the same way as one is artistic, or even in the same way as one is moral. Limiting religious faith to personal inclinations, to moments of the soul, Buber decried, is tantamount to its annihilation and the suicide of spirit. Rather, he argued, religious faith is attuned to the true ground of life, which one does not need some spiritual talent to unlock. Religious faith is responsive to the mandate of a being, the mandate of the being we usually call God, who Buber refers to as the absolute presence, and in I and thou, the eternal thou. So as Buber describes in his lectures, these lectures ultimately become I and thou. Religious faith has its foundation in the bond of being, a bond with being. And without this bond, all religious concepts and practices are vacuous, or at most a mere creation of the human, can I get down here? spirit, a species of art. So he says the bond of being is not properly called faith, but is established by virtue of a relationship to God. Sort of breaks down the German a little bit. It's really interesting, but I don't want to get hung up on it too much, but I do want to share it with you because it's not insignificant to how he ends up with ich and du, and my German is non-existent. So derived from the verb to pull, from Zeichen, Beichenhung denotes the dynamic quality of a mutual relationship between two autonomous subjects, an I, each, and a thou, a du. Buber viewed the each-du relationship between two individuals as bonding in and with being. That is the quintessential religious act, with God's presence refracted through the presence of a Gebener, another person whom one faces. In other words, basically seeing the face of God in another via that relationship with him. And it says here, Buber, as well as Rosenzweig, would render Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, God's reply to Moses' request to reveal God's name, as I shall be present as I shall be present. So I and thou and I and it are two ways of relating to the world. And we're either going to relate to a world in which God is present or not. Now, how do you do that? Now, this is why I wanted to do this little preamble before we got into the book. How do you communicate that? Well, one of the things shared in common by both Buber and Rosenzweig was ultimately a mistrust of religion, and to a certain extent, a mistrust as to the ability of reason or philosophy to speak to, I guess, the ground of being, ultimately what it was. And so he says here, God is thus not an object of Erlebnis. By the way, it was my dream to get a PhD in philosophy and learn German, but I did not end up doing that. An experience of one's detached subjectivity. God is not an object of one's detached subjectivity cut off from the world, as Buber said in 1923. In that essay, which was published right after I and Thou, he underscored that any experience is of concern to me only insofar as it is an event, or in other words, insofar as it pertains to the real God. Buber says that if I have at any time contributed to this perversion, I now feel duty bound to point this out all the more emphatically, that the religious does not begin in one's inner life, but is constituted by a mode of being in the world whereby one enters into relationship with the presence of the other, and ultimately with the presence of God. So in the I-thou relationship, one does not experience God, but meets the other. All right. So how do you communicate that? Well, not so easy, especially if you can't really use logic. So in I-thou, in his lectures, Buber assumed a conversational voice, often pausing to appeal to the audience to engage, saying, I ask you to grasp this as concretely as you are able. Each of you from your own life, from what you have known, in an unmediated way of the I-thou relationship. And in the book, he tries similarly to prompt his readers to do this introspective reflection. But he doesn't do it by direct appeal. You probably wouldn't be interested in reading it. It might not have survived this long. It's almost 100 years. Wow. In 2 years, it will be 100 years old. So he adopts a poetic pathos in an effort to evoke an aha effect and the acknowledgement of what he regards to be a common human experience. So I-thou is full of aphoristic formulations and evocative figures of speech. It says here, it has thus been characterized as a philosophical poem. So he thus conceded that he had no teaching to offer in a conceptually rigorous sense. What's the point? What's Buber's point? I only point to something in reality that had not or had too little been seen. I take him who listens to me by the hand and lead him to the window. I open the window and point to what is outside. I have no teaching, Buber said, but carry on a conversation. And this is beautiful. This is how I live my rabbinate, or aspire to. And he says, Mendes Flower says, it's precisely this poetic voice in which this conversation was conducted that Borges found so compelling about Buber's writing. All right, so let me stop here. That's my little way of an introduction into this book, I and Thou. Any questions? Yeah, go, Jeff.
So Mendes Floor, I remember him, actually. He was one of the scholars who he was part of the Jew in the Lotus dialogues.
He is him. He's really kept on that German Jewish existentialist scholarship.
So he's saying that it was the result of that after his initial attempts at teaching, which were abysmal.
He was trying to change what teaching was. The expectations of the audience were the problems. But okay, go on.
So Rosenzweig took him and tutored him, and it was through this that he developed his Ich and Du.
Yes, and I think that you have to. I think yes, it might have been abysmal, but Rosenzweig knew he was on the right track.
Okay, this is interesting because years ago, decades ago, who was the philosopher who was for several decades the main expositor of Buber? Was it Friedman?
Nachum Glatzer, perhaps?
Not Glatzer. No, it was another guy. Anyway, I read a biography many years ago. I think it was Friedman. And someone asked him, or he was recounting how he had asked him, how he came up with the I and Thou theology. And he said, one day he was in a mystical frame of mind. He was feeling at one with the universe. Yada. Do you remember that? Have you heard this?
No, but there's a question of if you believe the story, Jeff.
Yeah, if you believe the story.
Well, so that's interesting to me that you believe the mythical story of it. That's
fascinating. So he was already in Israel at the time, and a young man came to talk to him about the meaning of life, and he was only like giving the young man half of his attention.
Oh, yes. That's a famous story. He wasn't really paying attention to the young man who was in front of him. Yes, I've tried to ascertain if that story is true or not, and I can't track it down. And then the young man went and committed suicide, and he was not present for him in that moment. And out of that, I love that story. I haven't been able to ascertain if it's real or not, but it's a beautiful story. Any other questions? I want to get to the text because I want us to sort of process it. It is best read as a piece of poetry. Any other questions? All right, so let's take a look. You've got the preface. You know what this is going to be now. It's going to be different than what we are normally studying here in this class. All right. I'm going to pause from time to time. And if anybody wants to interrupt me, hold on. If anybody wants to interrupt me, you should feel free to go right ahead. I'm just going through. Here we go. All right. It's going to be masculine. So just a heads up. To man, the world is twofold in accordance with his twofold attitude. The attitude of man is twofold in accordance with the twofold nature of the primary words which he speaks. The primary words are not isolated words, but combined words. The one primary word is the combination I, thou. The other primary word is the combination I, it, wherein, without a change in the primary word, one of the words he and she can replace it. Hence, the I of man is also twofold. For the I of the primary word, I, thou, is a different I from that of the primary word, I, it. Okay, any questions? I told you. There we go. I got some smile. I told you it was going to be different. All right. That's Buber. All right. So there's got to be a reason he's telling it this way. And there has to be a reason why it has resonated. So basically, well, you know what? I'm not going to explain it. I'm not going to explain. I think that's the worst thing I could do. Let me just go on. Stop me when you want to chime in. Primary words do not signify things, but they intimate relations. Primary words do not describe something that might exist independently of them, but being spoken, they bring about existence. Primary words are spoken from the being. If thou is said, the I of the combination I, thou is said along with it. If it is said, the I of the combination I, it is said along with it. The primary word I, thou can only be spoken with the whole being. The primary word I, it can never be spoken with the whole being. I love it. It's different. That's right. Some people it's a different sort of way of doing it, but there is no I taken in itself, but only, sorry, that was me responding to someone texting me, but only the I of the primary word I, thou, and the I of the primary word I, it. When a man says I, he refers to one or other of these. The I to which he refers is present when he says I. Further, when he says thou or it, the I of one of the two primary words is present. The existence of I and the speaking of I are one and the same thing. When a primary word is spoken, the speaker enters the word and takes his stand in it. So the life of a human, let me stop here before any questions? Do you want me to try to explain? Are you interested in an explanation? Does everyone understand? Everyone follows this. Ben?
It makes more sense to me. I also studied this a long time ago. I took a class on this book in college as an undergrad. I don't think I understood it at all. I didn't understand any of these people writing in German. I don't know. It's something about the language that is just not translatable. But I didn't really get any of it. But now it makes a lot more sense to me. I think I think our exposure to maybe Eastern philosophy has made this idea less strange, that, there is no true, subjectivity without some kind of relationship with the world, and the way that we see, the nature of our relationship with the world is really what we're all about. That tells us who we are.
So in the Star of Redemption, which is Rosenzweig's classic book, he wrote the book, the story goes, from the Balkans fighting World War I in the trenches on postcards that he sent back to his mother. And the book begins, the first two words are from death, and the last two words of the book are into life. And the book begins with the image of him in the trenches, and he describes the whirling projectiles flying past his head. And he says, for all of the Hegelian philosophy, for all of these great Greek thinkers, nothing can stop the terror I fear that one of those projectiles is going to kill me. And it's totally subjective. And that really spoke to me. It was sort of that ultimate insistence on the importance of the subjectivity of the individual is the marking of, I think, what really allowed me to find my way into an existentialist Jewish philosophy that could be experienced and could be felt.
But this isn't that, right?
Well, I'm trying to instantiate it. So what I guess in a perfect world, and you've heard me read his writings, and they've called upon Martin Buber and the classic 1930 piece that I've shared with all of you, How Does Community Happen? He gives a little bit of a prescription and then says it's not a prescription. He gives a little bit of suggestion. He says it's not a suggestion, but how you bring people together under this concept of a living middle, where you acknowledge that there's something real in our midst and you try to find a way to bring people together around that. And in that midst, he said, community will
But there's
arise.
not only one real thing, there's two real things.
Well, that's right. That's
Right?
right. So,
I don't think
so tell me, what do you
that,
think? What do you think he means by that? The two real things. Good. So talk about that.
That there are two that we're like bivalent, that he says we have a twofold nature. And I don't know that he makes a judgment necessarily. As I remember, it's not like one is bad and one is good. God is in one of them and not in the other one. But I think he does say you can't be in one of them all the time. You can't live there, right? You can't constantly be confronting, other people.
That was the critique of his teaching. That was the critique of his teaching. Like, you can't live life in that state of constant I, thou ecstasy. It's gotten me into trouble.
But I don't think
I try to just sacrifice. I've just in my own work, I'll sacrifice a future plan for the sake of the moment. And because that's holy, the moment's holy, irrespective of what comes next. So, but yeah, that does create problems. Absolutely.
Right. I don't think he's saying, well, we should just have a one-fold nature and this should be it. He's not saying that. He's saying we have a twofold nature, and they're different, like we're either in sort of one sort of phase or we're in another, and there's things that we can find in one that we're not going to find in the other. But it's, being human is about both of them.
We are creatures, we are animals, and yet at the same time, we've had the breath of God breathed into us. So here he goes on, Ben, the life of human beings is not passed in the sphere of transitive verbs alone, does not exist in virtue of activities alone, which have something for their object. I perceive something, I am sensible of something, I imagine something, I will something, I feel something, I think something. The life of human beings does not consist of all this and the like alone. This and the like together establish that first realm that Ben was referring to, the realm of it, right? I perceive something, I imagine something, I will something, I feel something, I think something. That's the realm of it. But the realm of thou has a different basis. When thou is spoken, the speaker has no thing for his object. For where there is a thing, there is another thing. Every it is bounded by others. It exists only through being bounded by others. But when thou is spoken, there is no thing. Thou has no bounds. When thou is spoken, the speaker has no thing. He has indeed nothing, but he takes his stand in relation. Now, one of the ways that I've used to explain this to millennials is if you really want to be friends with someone because they have a large Twitter following and you want them to retweet something, you have turned that person. That is the quintessential I-it dynamic. Okay, you will something, you want something, and that person is not a human entity. They are really a means to an end for you. You've thingified them, right? It's the categorical imperative to a certain extent. Kantian's categorical imperative. You shouldn't treat people as mere means to your particular end, but rather they should be ends in and of themselves. I think that's sort of very much in line of what Buber is saying here. Steve, did you want to contribute? Steve, oh, no, you weren't. I was thinking maybe you were unmuted because you wanted to say something. Any comments on that? Any comments on those two types? So then Buber wants you to think, what are the relationships you have in your life that are genuinely I, thou? What are the genuine relationships you have in your life where you don't will that relationship into being, or don't will that thing into happening, or don't need for it to happen, but actually present yourself without a need for anything, but actually just in front of the other, without needs and without turning that other into a thing. Not so simple. And I like to say nigh impossible when everyone is wearing a mask. Everyone becomes a thing. It becomes very hard to see the thou when we are obscured from seeing the face of another. It becomes a great challenge. It's one of the reasons why I want to teach Buber, which I think Buber is so necessary 100 years after he wrote this, is because I feel a lot of us in this generation and the next generations are, I don't know, under emphasizing. Maybe they don't have the skill, maybe they don't have the fortitude, the wherewithal to enter into that relationship. They're scared to do it. They want to hide behind their phones. People want to hide behind their tweets and their text messages, but to actually stand in front of another human being without an agenda is scary. And yet it's the basis for where Buber finds God. And well, he'll argue where our tradition finds God as well. All right, so let's move on. It is said that man experiences his world. What does that mean? Man travels over the surface of things and experiences them. He extracts knowledge about their construction, their constitution from them. He wins an experience from them. He experiences what belongs to the things. But the world is not presented to man by experiences alone. These present him only with a world composed of it and he and she and it again. I experience something. If we add inner to outer experiences, nothing in the situation is changed. We are merely following the uninternal division that springs from the lust of the human race to whittle away the secret of death. Inner things or outer things, what are they but things and things? So the it is the thing, the it. I experience something. If we add secret to open experiences, nothing in the situation has changed. How self-confident is that wisdom which perceives a close compartment in things reserved for the initiate and manipulated only with the key. Oh, secrecy without a secret. Oh, accumulation of information. It, always it. Maybe a better word might be data. Always data. Accumulation of more data. We need more data. That's how it. The man who experiences has no part in this world. For it is in him and not between him and the world that he experience arises. It's all in him. It's all internal. The world has no part in the experience. It permits itself to be experienced, but has no concern in the matter. For it does nothing to the experience, and the experience does nothing to it. As experience, the world belongs to the primary word I, it. The primary word I, thou establishes the world of relation. So now one of the things I really want to do going forward is think out loud. Okay, so hello, I'm the senior rabbi. The senior rabbi will be thinking out loud going forward into this year. I think it's going to be important that we think out loud through some of these things. And I think it's fascinating to me when reading this, thinking about what Jewish professionals, funders, trends, philanthropists have told me about the millennial demographic. This is all pre-COVID. What do they care about more than anything else? Anyone know? It's all written in all the books. What do the millennials care about? Experiences. Experiences. That is where, can you create these experiences for them? As experience, the world belongs to the primary I, it. I think I've been guilty as a rabbi of trying to create these experiences. Jeff's been to some of them, and to a certain extent, they were I, its. Maybe they were not achieving the relation, maybe all the pomp and circumstance and, frills makes it sort of consumable. And I think in thinking out loud, I do wonder about our desire to curate these experiences for demographics and turning them into, living in the realm of I, it. Don.
Yeah, the I, it relationship, I keep, as I'm hearing this in my head, like there's something wrong with that. It's sort of like you're wrong for having the I, it relationship, and it's low and it doesn't acknowledge the other person's humanity. And that only seems to lead for me into, well, now I'm bad or I'm wrong. And that the thou, the I thou, that it all comes from the I thou, or the thou. It all comes from the thou. So the I it is an expression, maybe a distorted expression of the thou. So therefore, even when we're down here and we're not looking at our neighbor and we're judging them and we're not taking care of anything, that does not destroy who we are as thou. So
and I think that's right. And I think that point, Heschel comes later, but Heschel said 6 days out of the week, focus on space, focusing on, architecture in space, build buildings, be of this earth. And then one day out of the week, have an architecture in time, which is holy and profound and separate, and I think that's, what you and Ben are talking about, which is, you have to live in this world. You have to move things around. And there is a judgment here, which maybe still comes through in terms of the primary, and this is maybe what Simon was upset about, the primary focus on the sort of ecstatic relationship that two people have. And, it's like enough with the PDA, folks, enough with the public display of affection, get back to work. I can, that's an interesting way to, to think about it. But God, holiness, when we thingify ourselves, we maybe lose sight of that spirit, that godly element that is above our human materialistic nature. Let's go on a little bit. The spheres in which the world of relation arises are three. First, our life with nature. There, the relation sways in gloom beneath the level of speech. Creatures live and move over against us, but cannot come to us. And when we address them as thou, our words cling to the threshold of speech. Right? It's sort of, all right, we can't really address nature or creatures as thou. Is he saying that? We'll debate that in a bit. Second, our life with men. There, the relation is open and in the form of speech. We can give and accept the thou. Third, our life with intelligible forms. There, the relation is clouded, yet it discloses itself. It does not use speech, yet begets it. We perceive no thou, but nonetheless, we feel we are addressed and we answer, forming, thinking, acting. We speak the primary word with our being, though we cannot enter thou with our lips. But with what right do we draw what lies outside speech into relation with the world of the primary word? In every sphere in its own way, through each process of becoming that is present to us, we look out towards the fringe of the eternal thou. In each, we are aware of a breath from the eternal thou. In each thou, we address the eternal thou. Okay, so that was a lot there in that section. So let's try to go through this one at a time, the three spheres. First is our life with nature. So where does that, is that an I thou relationship? Is that an I it relationship? Creatures live, they move around us, they can't come to us. And when we address them as thou, our words cling to the threshold of speech. do we think? Do we have I thou relationships with creatures? Is that, anybody have a dog? Anybody own a dog?
For the
Yes,
past
I
2
do.
weeks.
I do.
And do you have an I thou? Is the dog a thing, or is the dog? If you had to use, Dale, the language of Buber, is your
Thou.
relationship? Yeah, tell us. Good, beautiful. Tell us why.
Well, I mean, it's what I strive for. You know, sometimes I don't pay as much attention to her as I should.
Well, it can't be all the time. It can't be all the time. That's right.
Yeah, I think actually the dog I had before this one, if you want to ask where I saw God in that doggie.
Tell us how.
She didn't, it was the shelter where I rescued her from, or that rescued her, the organization that rescued her said she did, when they described her in the picture on the internet, they said she doesn't have a mean bone in her body, but she's up to a good time. But she was from Muttville, a senior dog rescue. And she was just wonderful. Everybody loved her. She was such, I just, and when she died, of course, I went into depressed about it. And I thought, and I got angry at Judaism for saying that gods don't have a soul and they can't go to heaven. I still don't like that.
No, it's beautiful. No, can I pause you? Yeah, that's a beautiful insight. The idea that your I thou relationship is judged by anybody else, it would be offensive. Let me ask everybody here, what about a tree? Can you have an I thou relationship with a tree? I mean, come on, we're in the Bay Area. There must be some tree huggers here. Can you have an I thou relationship with a tree? Anybody? Ben?
Sure.
Sure. Well, that's exactly the next page. I consider a tree. I can look on it as a picture, stiff column in the shock of light or splash of green shot with the delicate blue and silver of the background. I can perceive it as movement, flowing veins on clinging, pressing pith, suck of the roots, breathing of the leaves, ceaseless commerce with earth and air and the obscure growth itself. I can classify it as a species and study it as a type in its structure and mode of life. I can subdue its actual presence and form so sternly that I recognize it only as an expression of laws in accordance with the constant opposition of forces is continually adjusted, or of those in accordance with which the component substances mingle and separate. I can dissipate it and perpetuate it in number and pure numerical relation. And in all of this, the tree remains my object, occupies space and time, and has its nature and constitution. It can, however, also come about, if I have both will and grace, that in considering the tree, I become bound up in relation to it. The tree is now no longer it. I have been seized by the power of exclusiveness. To effect this is not necessarily for me to give up any of the ways in which I consider the tree. There is nothing from which I would have to turn my eyes away in order to see, and no knowledge that I would have to forget. I don't have to unlearn all the data I've accumulated. Rather, is everything, picture and movement, species and type, law and number, indivisibly united in this event. It all comes together. Everything belonging to the tree is in this, its form, its structure, its colors, its chemical composition, its intercourse with the elements and with the stars are all present in a single whole. The tree is no impression, no play of my imagination, no value depending on my mood, but it is bodied over against me and has to do with me as I with it, only in a different way. Let no attempt be made to sap the strength from the meaning of the relation. Relation is mutual. The tree will have a consciousness then, similar to our own. Of that I have no experience. But do you wish, through seeming to succeed in it with yourself, once again to disintegrate that which cannot be disintegrated? I encounter no soul or dryad of the tree, but the tree itself. And I think that goes very well with what Dale was talking about with her dog. She experienced the dog. Steve.
Yes, talking about trees. I used to live in El Cerrito before moving to San Francisco. And when we moved, the only thing I missed about that house in El Cerrito is it had a wonderful olive tree in the backyard that every year I would get olives and make olives. And I really missed that tree. And it's sort of a feeling of, I don't know what, but that was, I still think about that olive tree that I miss.
It's amazing. Amazing. Thank you, Steve. Other thoughts? Oh, I'm going to start. Yeah, go right ahead.
Does this have any relation to the idea from, I can't remember his name, the one who wrote a Sefer Emet, the Rabbi of Ger, area of Ger.
The Gera Rebbe?
Well, he says that everything has its Nikudah Kodashah, everything has its point of holiness.
Yeah, so Buber had studied these Hasidic texts. I mean, Buber had written and retold a lot of these Hasidic stories and these Hasidic texts. And I do think that a lot of what he is getting at is sort of this ultimate relationship that sits at the heart of what some of those were trying to accomplish. But, I have to get through the Mendes Flower book. I wonder if he covers that, but that's a good question. But let's push it a little bit. Within the 5 minutes we have left, let me call on you. Nzinga, tell me about your I, thou, I, it relationships, right? Buber would want not me to teach, but Buber would want me to sort of engage in a dialogue and force the people here to sort of think through their own relationships. What do you make of this sort of framing?
I'm still processing it, honestly, but I think I think I'm still stuck back from earlier in the conversation when you were talking about thinking about ways that you show up in relationships and with no expectation. I think that was something that you said, and I think I kind of got stuck there in thinking about whether there are any relationships where I truly show up in that way. Like, I feel like I'm always expecting something, right? Good behavior, good grades, some flowers every now and then. It's just, it's interesting. But it got me sort of spiraling into this thinking about relationships where it's just sort of unconditional. There's some sort of anyway, sort of a rambling response, but that's sort of where I'm stuck.
Thank you. I called on you. That was beautiful. Thank you. I love that. I mean, I think that's what Buber is trying to. Buber wants you to spiral through all of your relationships, and even being aware that expecting flowers, expecting kindness, right? Think about those relationships or some of those dynamics that sometimes go awry. It's often because we've had a certain expectation the other person couldn't perhaps even know even of that expectation, yet we're responding to that expectation. We're not responding to the thou, we're responding to the it, and the it is the expectation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Other thoughts? What about you, Howard?
Hey, I do have some thoughts, and it has to do with a cat. We got this cat some years ago, and Vicky, cat, and she stayed with us for a number of years, and then she got sick. And we tried all these things, and nothing helped. And they told us to shove this medicine down her throat, and she ended up choking to death because she was trying to get rid of it, And then we got this other one, who was Lucy, and she's been with us for about 6 months, and she's totally different. And the reason I put this up was because we both had a life, and Lucy still has a life, but it was so sudden, and maybe life really will always look like it's a short-term sudden thing. I don't know. These two little kitty cats really affected me.
Thank you. I love that. I want to read one more section before we close. If I face a human being as my thou and say the primary word I thou to him, he is not a thing among things and does not consist of things. This human being is not he or she with X amount of followers or likes, bounded from every other he and she, a specific point in space and time within the net of the world. Nor is he a nature able to be experienced and described, a loose bundle of named qualities. But with no neighbor and whole in himself, he is thou and fills the heavens. This does not mean that nothing exists except himself, but all else lives in his light. Just as the melody is not made up of notes, nor the verse of words, nor the statute of lines, but they must be tugged and dragged until their unity has been scattered into these many pieces. So with the man to whom I say thou. I can take out from him the color of his hair or of his speech or of his goodness. I must continually do this, but each time I do it, he ceases to be thou. And just as prayer is not in time, but time in prayer, sacrifice not in space, but space in sacrifice, and to reverse the relation is to abolish the reality, so with a man to whom I say thou. I do not meet with him at some time and place or other. I can set him in a particular time and place. I must continually do it, but I set only a he or a she that is an it, no longer my thou. So long as the heaven of thou is spread out over me with the winds of causality cower at my heels, and the whirlpool of fate stays its course. I do not experience the man to whom I say thou, but I take my stand in relation to him in the sanctity of the primary word. Only when I step out of it do I experience him once more. In the act of experience, thou is far away. Even if the man to whom I say thou is not aware of it in the midst of his experience, yet relation may exist, for thou is more than it realizes. No deception penetrates here. Here is the cradle of the real life. Anybody here ever met someone really famous? Anybody here ever, come on, meet someone really super famous? Come on, someone, did you meet him or her, or did you meet, anyone have an example? Anyone wants to share an example with me? Nzinga has one, go right ahead.
When I was a kid, I met Bob Marley.
Holy shoot. Wow.
But I didn't believe it was really him. So that's.
Well, yes. No, I think that's it. How could you? That's right. And I was watching Bob Dylan, just something about this. Oh, 60 Minutes reposted an old interview with him. And he says, Bob Dylan said, the funniest thing is when I meet people, people come up to me and go, you're not really him, are you? He said all the time people do that. You're not really him. Because, right, there's a thing. Wow, you met Bob Marley. What was he like?
I mean, it was a long time ago. But I thought he was a pod person. I had recently seen the Body Snatchers movie with my dad, and he just, I just didn't believe that it was him. So
sure, how about that? And I think that right. So then you know, and I have found this with famous people, like it's like when I did events with rock stars. Oh, you sold this many albums, right? You have this many Twitter followers. All that stuff makes up who they are, as opposed to, so I always, and it wasn't always easy. I mean, the more I admired, the more I was gaga over the person, the harder it became for me to have an I thou relationship with them, just because it was so crazy. Although I could not, I'll give you one example and then I'll close. I could not have an I thou relationship with Gilbert Gottfried. I hosted him for a Friday night dinner. I think, Jeff, you might have been there. I hosted him for a Friday night dinner at 92Y Tribeca. And he just, I couldn't get through this persona. You know, it's funny because when we were backstage, he speaks one way, but then once he got on stage, he was Gilbert Gottfried. And I realized I was never going to crack through that persona. The only thing I could do was feed him softballs. And that, you know, and I realized, as opposed to some other conversations I had with people, that was just kind of an I relationship, which was a lot of his material, but, you know, never really capturing the thou. And when the dialogues that I've tried to do that I think are the most meaningful are the ones where we can capture the thou and get past all of the acclaim or credit and just get to the heart of the individual.
I met Gene Roddenberry once.
What was he like?
He was wonderful. He was very down to earth.
Well, ironically,
Yeah, he was a wonderful guy. Yeah, I was at a dinner at his table for dinner at a Star Trek convention. This was decades ago.
Wow. Amazing. I mean, Bob Marley, Gene Roddenberry. I mean, those are some heroes of mine. Steve.
Yeah, I came into this late. I think the one thing that's been missing this discussion is the concept of we being part of a family. That's really been exacerbated by the pandemic.
Beautiful.
Connecting with family and feeling, you know, I was in New York over the weekend talking with my son and his feeling of isolation. And I'm sure that's been a lot of young people have been feeling that. I don't know if you discussed that at all.
Oh, that's why this is so important. That's correct. This is the antidote. And the isolation, you know, is real because the technology, for all of its benefits, still doesn't sort of mediate, doesn't quite provide what Buber is speaking to here. And so there's this dissonance. I have a lot of Facebook friends. I have a lot of Twitter contacts. I have a lot of Instagram followers, but I am missing something. I'm missing some relationship, some part. And I think we don't even have the language anymore. I think Buber is giving us the language. Our tradition gives us the rituals to express that, but it's being lost in this new era. So thank you for allowing me to open up that with all of you. And if you have more suggestions for other topics that you'd like to get into, please feel free to email me. Next week's, we're going to be joined by the executive director of Shalom Bayit, which is the Jewish community's response to domestic violence. It is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, which is the month of October. So please join us. It's an important issue, especially in light of COVID. So thank you all for coming, and I wish you a good rest of the day. Take care.